On April 4th, 1968, at 6:01 in the evening, a single rifle shot was fired from a rooming house in Memphis, Tennessee. The man on the motel balcony fell. He was 39 years old. Most people know how Martin Luther King Jr. died. Fewer know how he lived. The full weight of it, the fear and the doubt alongside the courage, the private man alongside the public symbol. He was surveilled by his own government for years. The FBI sent him a letter suggesting he kill himself. He won the Nobel Peace Prize at 35. He was in jail when he wrote the most important letter in the history of American activism. He did not want to be a symbol. He wanted to go home. This is the full story of Martin Luther King Jr. From Atlanta to Memphis, nothing left out. Let's begin. Part 1. The Boy from Atlanta. 1929 to 1953. Michael King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. His father, Michael King Sr., known as Daddy King, was the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church on Auburn Avenue in the heart of Atlanta's black middle class. The family was not wealthy, but they were rooted. Church, community, education, expectation. Atlanta in 1929 was a rigidly segregated city. The boy who would grow up to challenge that segregation first encountered it as a child, when a white friend's parents told the boy he could no longer play with their son. He went home and asked his mother why. She told him the truth. He never forgot it. At 15, King entered Morehouse College, the historically black college in Atlanta that had educated his father and grandfather before him. He was precociously intelligent, socially confident, and in no hurry to become a preacher. He had watched his father's emotional, theatrical style from the pew and was not sure it was his. He changed his mind and his name. Michael King Sr. had renamed himself Martin Luther King in honor of the German reformer during a trip to Germany in 1934. He renamed his son as well. The boy who had been Michael became Martin. King graduated from Morehouse at 15, studied at Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, where he was one of only 6 black students, and graduated at the top of his class. He then enrolled in the doctoral program in systematic theology at Boston University. In Boston, he met a young woman named Coretta Scott, a music student from Alabama with her own ambitions and her own mind. She was not looking for a preacher's wife's life. She married him anyway, knowing what it would cost. How many of the people who changed the world were shaped in childhood by an ordinary moment of injustice that nobody else remembered? Part 2. Montgomery. 1954 to 1956. In January 1957, King co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, bringing together black ministers from across the South under a single organizational umbrella. The years that followed were years of building and of cost. King traveled constantly, 250,000 miles a year, speaking 350 times a year. He was away from Coretta and his children for months at a time. He carried the weight of a movement on a frame that was showing the strain. In September 1958, while signing copies of his first book in Harlem, King was stabbed in the chest by a mentally ill woman named Isola Curry. The blade came within millimeters of his aorta. A surgeon later told him that if he had merely sneezed before the operation, he would have died. King referenced this in his final speech 10 years later. The FBI began monitoring King in 1958. Director J. Edgar Hoover viewed him as a subversive, possibly a communist, and as a personal threat to the established order. The surveillance operation, eventually codenamed COINTELPRO, would grow into one of the most extensive domestic intelligence operations in American history. His phones were tapped. His hotel rooms were bugged. His associates were investigated. The file on Martin Luther King Jr. ran to millions of pages. King also faced criticism from within the movement, from younger activists who found his approach too slow, too deferential, too willing to negotiate. The tension between the SCLC's strategy of nonviolent direct action and the more confrontational approaches emerging from SNCC would deepen throughout the decade. What does it cost, physically, personally, privately, to carry a movement? And who pays attention to that cost while it is being paid? Part 2. Montgomery. 1954 to 1956. In April 1963, King launched Project C, a campaign to desegregate downtown Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was the most segregated city in America. Its public safety commissioner, Bull Connor, had a documented history of using violence against civil rights activity. King chose it deliberately. On April 12th, Good Friday, King defied a court injunction against the protests and led a march. He was arrested. He was placed in solitary confinement. In his cell, he read a newspaper that had been smuggled in. It contained an open letter from 8 white Alabama clergymen, moderate, well-meaning men, calling the Birmingham campaign unwise and untimely, and urging patience. King began writing in the margins of the newspaper. When he ran out of space, he wrote on toilet paper, on scraps passed to him by his lawyer. Over several days, in a Birmingham jail cell, he wrote what became known as the Letter from Birmingham Jail. It remains one of the most powerful pieces of political writing in American history. He addressed the clergymen directly, carefully, devastatingly. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill, he wrote, is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. He named the white moderate as a greater obstacle to justice than the outright racist. The person who preferred order to justice, who counseled patience to people who had been patient for centuries. We know through painful experience, he wrote, that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. He was released. The Birmingham campaign continued. Bull Connor turned fire hoses and dogs on children. The photographs went around the world. Kennedy introduced the Civil Rights Bill weeks later. Who were the people in your own time telling the oppressed to wait? And what would King's letter say to them? We're only halfway through his life. What's coming will surprise you. Part 3. The Movement and the Man. 1957 to 1962. In 1954, King accepted the pastorship of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. He was 25 years old. He had a doctorate, a young wife, a new baby, and a plan. Establish himself in Montgomery for a few years, build a reputation, and eventually return to academia or a major northern city. Montgomery had other plans. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old seamstress and NAACP secretary, refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery city bus to a white passenger. She was arrested. Within 48 hours, the black community of Montgomery had organized a bus boycott. They needed a leader. King was chosen partly because he was new to Montgomery. He had not yet made enemies, had not yet accumulated the political debts that made established figures cautious. He was young, eloquent, and not yet afraid. He accepted. What followed was 381 days of walking. The black community of Montgomery, 40,000 people, refused to ride the city buses. They walked to work, organized carpools, endured harassment and economic retaliation. King's house was bombed while Coretta and their infant daughter were inside. He told the crowd that gathered not to retaliate. On November 13, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that Montgomery's bus segregation was unconstitutional. On December 21st, Martin Luther King Jr. rode the first integrated bus in Montgomery, sitting in the front. He was 27 years old. He had just changed the world for the first time. What does it feel like to be chosen? Not because you ask to be, but because you happen to be in the right place at the right moment with the right voice. Part 4. Birmingham and the Letter. 1963. On August 28, 1963, King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial before 250,000 people and set his prepared remarks aside. The words that came next, "I have a dream," were not entirely new. He had used versions of them before, in smaller venues, to smaller crowds. But on those steps, on that afternoon, they became something permanent. The dream he described, of a nation that lived out the true meaning of its creed, of his children being judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, was received as the movement's highest expression. King privately worried it would be used to replace action with aspiration. He was right to worry. 3 weeks later, a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. 4 little girls were killed. Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Carol Denise McNair. Their ages, 14, 14, 14, 11. King delivered the eulogy. He stood in the church that had been bombed and spoke about children who had been murdered for the crime of going to Sunday school. He did not offer comfort as comfort. He offered it as indictment. In October 1964, King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He was 35 years old, the youngest recipient in the prize's history. He donated the entire prize money to the civil rights movement. The FBI responded to the Nobel announcement by sending King a package. Inside, recordings from bugs in his hotel rooms, evidence of extramarital affairs, and a note. The note encouraged him to kill himself before the recordings were made public. King read it. He showed it to Coretta. He did not kill himself. What does it mean to receive the world's highest peace prize and a suicide note from your own government in the same month? Part 5. The Dream and Its Price. 1963 to 1964. In early 1965, King turned the movement's focus to voting rights and to Selma, Alabama. After Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where 600 marchers were beaten by state troopers, King led the final march to Montgomery. 25,000 people walked 54 miles. On the steps of the Alabama Capitol, with the Confederate flag flying above, he asked, "How long?" Not long. The Voting Rights Act was signed that August. King had been central to its passage. He knew it would not be enough. In 1966, King took the movement north, to Chicago, to confront not legal segregation, but economic segregation, housing discrimination, and the specific poverty of the urban black community. He moved his family into a slum apartment on the west side. The reception was hostile in a way he had not encountered in the South. A march through the all-white Marquette Park neighborhood was met by a crowd throwing bricks and bottles. King was struck by a rock. He later said it was the most frightening moment of his career, more frightening than anything he had faced in Alabama. The Chicago campaign produced a limited housing agreement that was almost immediately abandoned by city officials. It was King's most significant tactical failure. And in April 1967, at Riverside Church in New York City, King did something that divided his own coalition. He came out publicly against the Vietnam War. The White House condemned him. The NAACP distanced itself. Longtime supporters accused him of jeopardizing the Civil Rights Coalition by alienating the Johnson administration. King said he could not remain silent. "A time comes," he said, "when silence is betrayal." What do you owe the movement that made you? And at what point does loyalty to it become a cage around what you know to be true? Part 6. Selma, Chicago, and the Widening. 1965 to 1967. By early 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was exhausted. The surveillance had not stopped. The death threats had multiplied. The movement was fragmented between black power and integration, between Vietnam and domestic policy, between the generations. King's own depression, which he had struggled with throughout his life, which he had inherited from his father, who had also struggled with it, was deepening. He was planning something new, the Poor People's Campaign. A march on Washington not just for Black Americans, but for all poor Americans, regardless of race. He had come to believe that civil rights without economic rights was incomplete. He was planning to bring thousands of poor people to Washington and have them stay, to set up a tent city on the National Mall until Congress acted. In March 1968, he went to Memphis. Memphis sanitation workers, almost all of them black, had gone on strike after 2 workers were crushed to death in a garbage truck. The city refused to recognize their union or improve their conditions. The workers marched with signs reading, "I am a man." King came to speak. The march he led turned violent, not from the marchers, but from outside agitators who broke windows and looted. King was rushed from the scene. He was devastated. The first march he had led that had ended in violence. He came back. On April 3, 1968, the night before his death, King delivered a speech at Mason Temple in Memphis. He had not planned to go. He was tired, and the weather was bad. The crowd was waiting. He went. He spoke about the death threats, about the bomb threat on his flight to Memphis that morning. He said it did not matter. He said he had been to the mountaintop, that he had looked over and he had seen the promised land. He might not get there with them, he said, but the people would get there. He sat down. He wept. The next evening, April 4th, at 6:01, he stepped onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. A single shot was fired from a rooming house across the street. He died at St. Joseph's Hospital at 7:05 p.m. He said he might not get there with them. He was right. What does it mean to lead people towards something you know you will not live to see? Martin Luther King Jr. was 39 years old when he died. In those 39 years, he had been stabbed, bombed, surveilled, wiretapped, threatened, and sent a letter by his own government suggesting he end his life. He had led a bus boycott, organized a march on Washington, written a letter in a jail cell that is still being read, delivered a speech that is still being quoted, and helped pass 2 of the most important laws in American history. He had also been depressed, exhausted, unfaithful to his wife, and uncertain, in his final months, whether any of it was working. The monument on the National Mall shows him emerging from stone, arms crossed, expression severe. The man in the monument is not the man in the hotel rooms, The man on the phone with Coretta at 2 in the morning. The man who wept after the speech in Memphis. Both are real. The courage and the doubt. The dream and the exhaustion. The mountaintop and the motel balcony. He did not get there with them. The question he kept asking, how long, is still being asked. If you found this video worth your time, subscribe and stay. More names are coming, more full stories. Nothing left out.